At 06:30 on February 10, 1945, Captain Edwin Hunt stood on the west bank of the River Maas near Gennep, Netherlands, watching German artillery pound the far shore where British engineers were supposed to build a bridge in 48 hours. 24 years old, 8 months since D-Day, 0 bridges built under enemy fire on flooded rivers. The Germans had blown the Schwammenauel Dam the previous night. 81,000 acre-feet of water was pouring down the Ruhr Valley into the Maas at a rate that would turn a 300-meter-wide river into a 1,200-meter inland sea within 72 hours. Hunt had commanded 15 rhino ferries on Gold Beach on the 6th of June, 1944. Those shallow-draft landing craft had put 93,000 vehicles ashore in 4 months. Tanks, guns, half-tracks, 440,000 tons of military stores. The Admiralty had sent him back to England in September with a promotion and new orders. Report to Second Army. Chief Engineer needs a waterman who understands rivers. He had met Lieutenant Constant Lambrechtsen van Rhythem in December, a Dutch hydraulics engineer, 38 years old, 20 years with Rijkswaterstaat, the Netherlands government water authority. Lambrechtsen had spent 2 decades studying the Maas, the Rhine, every tributary and floodplain between the German border and the North Sea. He understood water the way Hunt understood boats. Operation Veritable had kicked off 2 days earlier on February 8th. 50,000 men, 500 tanks, the largest British-Canadian offensive since Normandy. The plan was simple. Drive southeast from Nijmegen through the Reichswald forest, clear the Germans from the ground between the Maas and the Rhine, then cross the Rhine itself and take the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. But the plan required bridges. Lots of bridges. And the Germans knew it. Hunt had watched the intelligence reports come in throughout January. German engineers preparing demolitions on every dam upstream. The Schwammenauel, the Erftalsperre. 5 dams total controlling the headwaters of the Ruhr River, which fed into the Maas downstream. American forces were fighting through the Hürtgen forest, trying to capture the dams before the Germans could destroy them. They had failed. The 78th Infantry Division had finally taken the Schwammenauel Dam on February 9th. But German sappers had blown the discharge valves and jammed the gates open before retreating. The reservoir was emptying at maximum flow. An 18-foot water was crashing down the Ruhr Valley. Within hours, it would reach the Maas. British 30th Corps needed to cross the Maas at Gennep. The 51st Highland Division had just liberated the town after 2 days of house-to-house fighting. 1,200 buildings, most of them rubble. The Germans had blown the permanent bridge on their way out. They had also blown the railway bridge. Both spans lay twisted in the current. Brigadier Campbell, chief engineer of Second Army, had visited Hunt and Lambrechtsen on January 30th. He had spread maps across a table in a farmhouse south of Nijmegen. The Maas was normally 300 meters wide at Gennep. Lambrechtsen had studied rainfall data, snowmelt projections, upstream reservoir capacities. He had calculated flood predictions going back to December, when planning for Veritable had begun. The Dutch engineer had told Campbell the river would be 1,200 meters wide by mid-February, maybe wider. The floodplain would be under 3 to 4 feet of water. Standard Bailey Bridge sections would not work. They needed something that could float, something that could adjust to changing water levels, something that could span over a kilometer of moving water. Campbell had stared at the numbers. 1,200 meters. 4,000 feet. No one had ever built a floating Bailey bridge longer than 600 meters. Not in this war, not in any war. If you want to see how Hunt and Lambrechtsen solved the impossible problem of bridging a flooded river under fire, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Hunt. Hunt looked at the water now. The mass was already rising. He could see the current picking up speed, debris flowing past, tree branches, sections of fence. A dead cow tumbled in the brown water. Montgomery needed this bridge. Operation Veritable was stalled. The 51st Highland was across the river in Gennep, but they could not advance without armor and artillery. The Canadians were bogged down in the Reichswald. German resistance was fiercer than intelligence had predicted. The entire operation depended on getting heavy equipment across the Maas. Hunt had 48 hours to build the longest floating bridge in military history, in a flood, under German artillery, with a Dutch engineer he had known for 6 weeks. And if he failed, 50,000 men would be trapped on the wrong side of a river that was about to become a lake. Hunt had arrived at 2nd Army headquarters in Den Bosch on October 2, 1944, 3 days after the city's liberation. The chief engineer's staff had set up operations in the town hall. Maps covered every wall: the Maas, the Rhine, the Waal, every river between the Allied front lines and Berlin. Brigadier Campbell had explained the problem. Montgomery's 21st Army Group was planning a winter offensive into Germany. The attack would require crossing multiple rivers. The Germans would blow every bridge. Allied engineers would need to replace them. Fast, under fire, in conditions no one had trained for. Campbell needed someone who understood water, not just bridge construction, water itself, currents, tides, flood dynamics. Someone who could look at a river and know whether a bridge would hold or wash away in the first hour. Hunt's file had crossed Campbell's desk in late September. Rhino Ferry Commander, Gold Beach, 93,000 vehicles delivered, 440,000 tons of stores, 0 ferries lost to tides or currents. The Navy had noted something unusual. Hunt had predicted tide changes more accurately than the charts. He had positioned his ferries in currents that other commanders avoided. He had an instinct for water. Campbell had given Hunt an office and a stack of hydrological surveys, Dutch government data, German engineering reports captured in France, rainfall records going back 20 years. Hunt had studied the Maas for 6 weeks before he met Lambrechtsen. The Dutch engineer had walked into Hunt's office in early December. No appointment. He had simply appeared one morning with a leather satchel full of maps. The British had located him in a refugee center in Eindhoven. A civil engineer with Rijkswaterstaat, the Netherlands government water authority. He had spent 20 years managing flood control on the Maas and Rhine river systems. Lambrechtsen had spread his maps across Hunt's desk. Hand-drawn, decades of measurements, water levels at every season, snowmelt patterns, spring floods, summer droughts. He had measured the Maas in places where the river had not existed on British maps. Old channels, overflow routes, sections of floodplain that only filled once every 10 years. The two men had worked together through December and January. Hunt provided military requirements, bridge capacity, load ratings, construction timelines. Lambrechtsen provided predictions, where the river would be, how high, how fast, what the bottom looked like, whether pontoons would hold or drag. By late January, they had identified Gennep as the critical crossing point. The town sat on high ground on the east bank. The west bank at Uffeld had a solid approach road. The ferry crossing that had operated there for centuries proved the riverbed was stable. And the floodplain was wide enough that even a major flood would spread out rather than concentrate into a destructive channel. But Lambrechtsen had warned about the dams. The Schwammenauel Dam alone held 81,000 acre-feet of water. If the Germans destroyed it, or even damaged the outlet controls, the resulting flood could raise the Maas by 15 feet, maybe more. The river would spread across the entire floodplain. A standard fixed bridge would be underwater. Pontoons anchored to the banks would rip loose. They needed a floating bridge. But floating Bailey bridges had limitations. The longest one built so far in the war was the Blackfriars Bridge over the Rhine at Recede, 555 meters including approaches. And that had been built in calm conditions after the fighting had moved east. Gennep would require 1,200 meters, maybe 1,300 if the flood was as bad as Lambrechtsen predicted. Twice the length of any floating Bailey bridge ever attempted, built during active combat operations, on a river that was rising by the hour. Campbell had listened to their proposal on January 30th. He had studied Lambrechtsen's calculations, checked the math twice. Then he had turned to his second-in-command, Colonel Otto Phibbs, and issued orders. Tell the sappers at Mook to start building 80-foot floating Bailey sections. Keep building until we tell them to stop. We are going to need every meter they can produce. The 51st Highland Division had attacked Gennep on February 11th. The Germans had defended every building, every street. The Scots had fought through rubble and minefields for 36 hours. By dawn on February 12th, the Union Jack flew over what remained of the town hall. Hunt stood on the west bank now, February 10th, 48 hours before the Highlanders would finish clearing Gennep, 72 hours before his engineers could even start building, and the water was already rising faster than Lambrechtsen had calculated. On February 5th, a Canadian Spitfire had flown the reconnaissance mission that confirmed Lambrechtsen's worst predictions. Flight Lieutenant Lightbody, Photographic Reconnaissance Unit. He had taken his aircraft down to 100 feet over the Maas floodplain. Forward-facing oblique photographs every 2 seconds. The images had arrived at 2nd Army headquarters 6 hours later. The German trenches along the east bank were already waterlogged. The lock at Sambeek, 3 kilometers upstream, was under 2 feet of water, and this was before the Schwammenauel Dam had blown. Lambrechtsen had studied the photographs with a magnifying glass. He had pointed out features that meant nothing to the intelligence officers, but everything to a hydraulics engineer. The weir at Sambeek had been scoured by November floods. A bypass channel had formed around it. The weir gates were ineffective. The Germans could not manipulate water levels even if they wanted to. That was good news and bad news. Good because it meant the flood would be predictable. Bad because it meant nothing would slow the water coming downstream from the Rohr Valley. Hunt had requisitioned 140 lorries on February 8th. The 7th Army Troops engineers had been building Bailey Bridge sections at a depot near Mook since early February. 80-foot floating sections, 6 rows of 30 pontoon units joined together. Each section weighed 11 tons. Each section required specialized handling equipment. The lorries had arrived at the depot on February 9th. The same day, the Schwammenauel Dam fell. The same day, German sappers destroyed the discharge valves. The convoy had loaded through the night. Bailey panels, pontoons, decking, ramps, anchoring equipment, welding gear. Every component needed to build a floating bridge that did not yet have a final design because no one knew exactly how wide the river would be when construction started. The convoy had staged in the town square at St. Anthony's, 4 kilometers west of the Maas. 140 lorries packed with bridge components, waiting for the order to move forward, waiting for the 51st Highland Division to clear Gennep so the engineers could begin work. Hunt had watched the Highlanders attack on February 11th, the 5th Battalion Black Watch, the 7th Gordons, the 1st Gordons, Scottish infantry fighting through a town that the Germans had turned into a fortress. Every house was a strong point, every street was mined. The Germans had 19 days to prepare defenses after they retreated across the Maas in late January. 19 days to wire explosives, dig trenches, position machine guns. The battle for Gennep had lasted 36 hours, house to house, room to room. The Scots had taken casualties from snipers, mortars, mines, and artillery. German 88th millimeter guns firing from positions east of the river. The shells had crashed into buildings that were already burning. Rubble had collapsed into the streets. The Highlanders had pushed through anyway. By dawn on February 12th, it was over. The Germans had withdrawn across the Neers River, 2 kilometers east of Gennep. They had blown both bridges behind them, the permanent road bridge, the railway bridge. Both spans dropped into the current. Steel and concrete twisted into barriers that made the Maas uncrossable by conventional means. Hunt had entered Gennep 2 hours after the last German soldier retreated. 1,200 buildings, maybe 300 still standing. The rest were rubble. Walls without roofs, roofs without walls. The town center was gone. The ferry house on the riverbank, where generations of Dutchmen had operated the crossing, was a pile of bricks. But the ferry approaches were intact. The roads leading down to where the ferry had docked were still solid. Lambrechtsen had been right. This was the place to build. The approaches would save nearly 1,000 meters of Bailey bridging. Once the floodplain dried, those approach roads would be usable immediately. The bridge would only need to span the actual river channel, not the temporary floodplain. Except the floodplain was not going to dry. Not for weeks, maybe months. Hunt had stood on the west bank and watched the Maas rise. The water was already 50 meters wider than normal. Brown, fast, debris flowing past every few seconds. The current was picking up speed as more water poured down from the Rohr Valley. He had 48 hours before Montgomery's staff would demand answers. How long to build the bridge? How much weight it could carry? When the first tanks could cross? Questions that Hunt could not answer, because the river was still changing, still rising, still spreading across the floodplain that Lambrechtsen had predicted would be 1,200 meters wide. The 7th Army Troops engineers were ready. 140 lorries loaded with bridge sections, crews trained on Bailey construction, welders, riggers, boat operators who could position pontoons in moving water. Everything was ready except the river itself. Construction began at 0700 on February 12th. The Maas had risen another meter overnight. Lambrechtsen had measured the floodplain at dawn, 1,100 meters from the west bank approach road to the east bank, and still rising. Hunt had positioned his command post in what remained of a warehouse on the Ophelt side. The building had no roof, but 3 walls were standing, enough shelter to spread maps and protect radio equipment from the rain that had started falling at 0400. Cold rain. February in the Netherlands. Mud everywhere. The 7th Army Troops engineers had moved forward from St. Anthonis before sunrise. 140 lorries rolling through the dark. They had staged along the approach road. Crews had begun unloading bridge sections immediately. Each 80-foot section required 6 men to maneuver. 11 tons of steel panels in pontoon boxes. The sections had to be assembled on dry ground, then floated into position. The plan was to build from both banks simultaneously. 2 construction crews, one working east from Ophelt, one working west from Gennep. They would meet in the middle. Standard Bailey Bridge procedure. Except nothing about this bridge was standard. A Class 40 Bailey pontoon bridge consisted of prefabricated steel panels mounted on floating pontoon units. Each pontoon was a watertight steel box, 4 feet wide, 7 feet long, 30 inches deep. The boxes were joined together in groups to create floating platforms. The bridge deck sat on top of the platforms. The entire structure could flex with wave action and adjust to changing water levels. But the system had limits. The pontoons had to be anchored, not to the riverbed, which was too deep and the current too strong, to the banks. Heavy cables ran from each pontoon platform to anchor points driven into the ground on both shores. The cables allowed the bridge to rise and fall with the water level, while preventing it from washing downstream. At 1,100 meters, the bridge would require over 100 separate pontoon platforms, over 400 individual pontoon boxes, more than 800 anchor cables, and every cable had to be precisely tensioned. Too loose and the bridge would sag or drift. Too tight and the cables would snap when the water level changed. Lambrechtsen had calculated the cable tensions. He had factored in current velocity, water depth, wind load, and the weight of vehicles crossing the bridge. His calculations filled 16 pages of handwritten notes. Hunt had watched him work through the math 3 times, checking, rechecking. The Dutch engineer was betting his reputation that the numbers were right. The first pontoon platform went into the water at 0930 on the Ophelt side. 6 sappers guided it into position using poles and ropes. The current grabbed it immediately. The platform swung downstream. The anchor crew drove stakes into the muddy ground and ran cables. It took 40 minutes to secure one platform. Hunt had done the arithmetic. 100 platforms, 40 minutes each, 4,000 minutes, 66 hours, nearly 3 days just to position the pontoons, and that assumed perfect conditions. No German artillery, no equipment failures, no accidents. The German artillery started at 1000 hours, 88mm guns firing from positions east of the Nears River. The shells screamed overhead and burst along the west bank. Shrapnel sprayed across the approach road. 1 lorry took a direct hit. Bailey panels scattered across the mud. 3 sappers were wounded, 2 seriously. The engineers kept working. They had no choice. Montgomery's entire offensive depended on this bridge. Operation Veritable was stalled in the Reichswald. The 51st Highland Division was isolated in Gennep, with no heavy weapons and dwindling ammunition. The Canadians were taking casualties trying to advance through flooded terrain without armored support. 30th Corps needed tanks across the Maas. Now. By nightfall on February 12th, the engineers had positioned 8 pontoon platforms on the Ophelt side, 6 on the Gennep side, 14 platforms total, roughly 110 meters of bridge, 1/10 of what they needed. The rain intensified after dark. The temperature dropped. The Maas continued rising. Lambrechtsen measured the water level every 2 hours. By midnight, the floodplain was 1,180 meters wide. Hunt calculated they would need 148 pontoon platforms, 50 more than originally planned, and the Germans had found the range. February 13th. The engineers worked through the night. Searchlights powered by generators illuminated the work areas on both banks. The lights made perfect targets for German gunners. Shells fell every 15 minutes, sometimes closer together. The sappers learned to recognize the sound, the whistle of incoming rounds, the flat crack of impact, the whine of shrapnel through the air. 21 platforms in the water by dawn, 30% of the bridge built. But the pace was slowing. The pontoon boxes were harder to maneuver as the platforms extended further into the current. The river was flowing at nearly 6 knots, fast enough to rip a platform loose if the anchor cables were not secured immediately. One platform broke free at 0300. 6 sappers had been guiding it into position when an anchor cable snapped. The platform swung sideways into the current. The men jumped clear. The platform tumbled downstream, end over end, pontoon boxes breaking apart. 11 tons of steel and decking disappeared into the darkness. 200 meters of bridge material gone in 30 seconds. Hunt had requisitioned replacement pontoons from the depot at Mook, but Mook was running low. The entire Second Army was building bridges. The Rhine crossing was weeks away, but preparations were already underway. Every floating Bailey section in the Allied inventory was spoken for. Hunt's bridge was getting what was available, nothing more. Lambrechtsen spent February 13th making new calculations. The river had peaked at 1,190 meters, wider than he had predicted. But the rate of rise was slowing. The Schwammenauel reservoir was nearly empty. The flood wave had passed. The Maas would stay at this level for several days, then begin a slow decline as the upstream flow decreased. That was the good news. The bad news was the wind. Weather forecasts predicted strong winds from the northwest starting February 15th. Winds across a kilometer of open water would create waves. Waves would stress the pontoon platforms. Waves would make it nearly impossible to position the final sections in the middle of the river where the current was strongest. The engineers had a window, 48 hours, maybe 60. They had to complete the bridge before the wind arrived. After that, construction would become too dangerous. Platforms could break loose. Cables could snap. Men could drown in water cold enough to kill in minutes. Hunt pushed the crews harder. 12-hour shifts became 18-hour shifts. Sappers worked until they could barely stand. Then they worked longer. Hot food arrived from field kitchens every 6 hours. Tea, stew, bread. The men ate standing up, ate while walking, ate while driving anchor stakes into frozen mud. German artillery increased on February 14th. The guns were firing from multiple positions now, not just from east of the Nears, from north of Gennep, from south near Ottersum. The Germans had observers spotting for the guns. Every time the engineers concentrated in one area, shells arrived within minutes. 4 sappers were killed on February 14th. Direct hit on a work crew positioning a platform near the Gennep shore. The blast threw 2 men into the river. The current took them before anyone could react. 2 others died instantly from shrapnel. The crew kept working. They secured the platform, moved to the next one. By nightfall on February 14th, 61 platforms were in the water. Roughly half the bridge was complete. But the engineers were exhausted. Injuries were mounting. Frostbite, trench foot, cuts and bruises from handling steel panels in the dark. 3 men had been evacuated with broken bones, falls from platforms, crushed hands, the kind of accidents that happen when men work past the point of fatigue. And then the floodplain began to drain. Lambrechtsen noticed it first. The water level was dropping. Not much, 2 centimeters per hour, but dropping. The flood wave had passed completely. The river was returning to normal flow levels, which meant the pontoon platforms that had been positioned in 3 feet of water yesterday were now in 2 feet of water. The cables were too tight. The platforms could not adjust. Crews had to go back and retension every cable, every platform. 61 platforms, 8 cables per platform, 488 cables. The work that should have been moving forward was now moving backward. Hunt calculated the delay. 6 hours minimum, maybe 8. 6 hours they did not have. And the wind was coming. The engineers worked through February 15th, retensioning cables. Every platform had to be adjusted as the water level dropped. The work was technical, precise. A cable too loose would allow the platform to drift. Too tight, and it would snap when vehicles crossed and the bridge flexed under load. Lambrechtsen moved from platform to platform with a measuring tape and notebook. He checked cable angles, measured water depth, calculated new tension values. His hands were raw from the cold. His uniform was soaked from spray coming off the river. He had not slept in 36 hours. Hunt established a relay system. Runners carried Lambrechtsen's calculations from the river to crew chiefs on both banks. The chiefs adjusted cable tensions based on the numbers. No guesswork, no approximations. Every cable tensioned exactly to specification. It was slow, methodical, and it was costing them hours they could not afford. The wind arrived at 1400 hours on February 15th. Northwest winds, exactly as forecast, 20 kilometers per hour initially, building to 30 by nightfall. Waves formed across the open water, half-meter swells rolling from the Ophelt side toward Gennep. The pontoon platform started moving, rising and falling, flexing against the anchor cables. 3 cables snapped between 1400 and 1600 hours. The platforms did not break loose, but they shifted position. Crews had to re-anchor them. More delays, more time lost. German observers spotted the activity. Artillery fire intensified. The Germans understood what the British were building. A bridge this long could only mean one thing. Montgomery was preparing to move armor across the Maas. The Germans threw everything available at the construction site: 88mm guns, 105mm howitzers, mortars. 7 sappers were wounded on February 15th, 2 killed. A mortar round landed directly on a work crew near the center of the river. The blast knocked 4 men off a platform into the water. 2 were pulled out immediately. 1 drowned before rescuers could reach him. His body was recovered 3 hours later, 200 meters downstream. But the bridge was growing. 78 platforms by nightfall on February 15th. 89 platforms by dawn on February 16th. The two halves were approaching each other. The Ophelt side had extended 540 meters into the river. The Gennep side had reached 490 meters. 50 meters of open water remained between them. This was the most dangerous phase. The final platforms had to be positioned in the deepest, fastest part of the channel. The current was strongest here. 7 knots. Strong enough to pull a man under in seconds. Strong enough to drag a pontoon platform downstream if the anchor crew was not perfectly coordinated. Hunt brought in his best crews for the final section. Sappers who had been working since February 12th, men who could position a platform in the dark, who could drive anchor stakes into frozen ground while standing waist-deep in moving water, who could splice a snapped cable under fire. The gap closed on February 17th, platform by platform. The Ophelt crew pushed east. The Gennep crew pushed west. 40 meters, 30 meters, 20 meters. German artillery fell continuously. Shells burst in the water, on the platforms, along both banks. The engineers ignored it. They had a job. They were going to finish it. At 16:45 on February 17th, the final platform was positioned. Sappers from both sides met in the middle of the River Maas. They connected the last Bailey panels, bolted them into place, laid the final sections of decking. The bridge was complete. 1,190 meters, 3,904 feet, the longest floating Bailey bridge built during World War II. But it was isolated. The floodplain on both sides was still under 2 feet of water. The approach roads ended at the riverbank. Tanks could not reach the bridge. Vehicles could not cross. The engineers had built a bridge to nowhere. They had 72 hours to build causeways across the flooded ground. 72 hours before Montgomery's staff would demand results. And the Germans were not finished yet. The causeway construction began immediately. The floodplain was drying, but too slowly. 2 feet of standing water covered the ground between the solid approach roads and the riverbanks where the bridge began. Vehicles could not drive through water that deep. They would bog down in mud. Engines would flood. The entire crossing would become a traffic jam under German artillery fire. Hunt's engineers built temporary roadways across the flooded sections. Crushed stone, gravel, Bailey bridge panels laid flat to create a solid surface. The work was brutal. Trucks dumped tons of fill material into standing water. Sappers spread it by hand. Shovels, rakes, boots sinking into mud with every step. The causeway on the Ophelt side required 200 meters of fill. The Gennep side needed 170 meters. Both had to support the weight of Churchill tanks, 40 tons each, the heaviest armor in the British inventory. If a tank broke through the causeway surface, it would sink into the mud, block the entire crossing, trap every vehicle behind it. Lambrechtsen calculated the load-bearing requirements. 6 inches of crushed stone minimum, 8 inches in sections where the mud was deepest, compacted, graded. Drainage ditches dug along both sides to channel water away from the roadbed. The work required precision in conditions that made precision nearly impossible. German artillery shifted targets on February 18th. The guns had been hitting the bridge itself. Now they targeted the causeways. Shells fell among the work crews. Explosions threw mud and gravel into the air. Craters formed in the freshly laid roadbed. Crews filled the craters, laid more stone, kept moving. 6 sappers were wounded on February 18th, 1 killed, shrapnel from a mortar round. The medical teams evacuated casualties across the half-finished causeway. Stretchers carried through ankle-deep water. The wounded loaded into ambulances that drove back toward the field hospital at Boxmeer. By nightfall on February 18th, the causeways were 70% complete. But the bridge had not been tested. No vehicles had crossed. No one knew if the pontoon platforms would hold under the weight of armor. No one knew if the cables would snap, if the bridge would flex too much and break apart, if the current would drag the entire structure downstream. Hunt ordered a test crossing at 0800 on February 19th. A single jeep, light vehicle, 4 men. If the jeep made it across, they would try heavier vehicles, lorries, artillery pieces, eventually tanks. But first, the jeep. The vehicle entered the bridge from the Ohlfeld side at 0815. The driver moved slowly, 10 kilometers per hour. The bridge deck swayed under the weight. The pontoon platforms rose and fell with the motion. Cables creaked, steel panels groaned. The jeep continued. 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. German artillery opened fire at 0820. Shells fell around the bridge. Geysers of water erupted along both sides. The jeep did not stop. The driver maintained speed, steady, controlled. The vehicle reached the halfway point, kept going. The Gennep side was visible ahead. 300 meters, 200 meters, 100 meters. The jeep rolled off the bridge onto the Gennep causeway at 0832. 17 minutes to cross 1,190 meters. The bridge had held. The test was successful. Hunt immediately ordered heavier vehicles forward. A 3-ton lorry crossed at 0900, then a 5-ton lorry, then a universal carrier. Each vehicle stressed the bridge more than the last. Each crossing proved the structure could handle the load. By noon on February 19th, 20 vehicles had crossed. By nightfall, over 100. The bridge was operational, but it was not open, not officially. Montgomery wanted to see it first. Churchill wanted to see it. The Prime Minister and the Field Marshal were coming to Gennep. They would inspect the longest Bailey Bridge built during the war. They would watch the first tanks cross, and if the bridge failed with Churchill standing on it, the entire operation would become a disaster that no amount of engineering success could overcome. The dignitaries were scheduled to arrive on February 21st. Hunt had 48 hours to guarantee the bridge would not collapse under the weight of 50 Churchill tanks crossing simultaneously while the Prime Minister of Great Britain watched from the West Bank. February 20th, the final preparations. Hunt inspected every pontoon platform, every cable, every anchor point. Lambrechtsen remeasured water levels. The floodplain was still draining, slowly. The water level had dropped another 10 centimeters overnight. Cables needed adjustment again. The crews worked through the morning. The first heavy armor crossed at 1400 hours. A troop of Churchill tanks, 4 vehicles, each weighing 40 tons. The tanks entered the bridge single file, 30 meters between vehicles, standard crossing procedure. The bridge deck sagged under the weight. The pontoon platform sank lower in the water, but the structure held. More tanks followed, the 7th Armored Division, the Guards Armored Division. By nightfall on February 20th, over 200 vehicles had crossed the Maas at Gennep. Tanks, self-propelled guns, ammunition carriers. The bridge handled every load. The cables held. The pontoons stayed afloat. Winston Churchill arrived at 1100 hours on February 21st. Field Marshal Montgomery accompanied him. Also present were Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, Commander of British Second Army. The senior leadership of the British war effort, standing on the west bank of the Maas, watching tanks roll across a bridge that had not existed 9 days earlier. Hunt and Lambrechtsen stood with the dignitaries. Neither man had slept in over 60 hours. Both were covered in mud. Churchill spoke briefly with Hunt, asked about the construction timeline, asked about casualties. Hunt reported 8 sappers killed, 23 wounded. The Prime Minister nodded, looked at the bridge stretching across the river, said it was magnificent work. Montgomery walked partway across the bridge. He inspected the pontoon platforms, examined the cable anchoring system, watched a Churchill tank pass within meters of where he stood. The entire structure swayed under the weight, but remained stable. Montgomery returned to the West Bank. He told Hunt the bridge had saved Operation Veritable. The 7th Army Troops engineers had built 1,190 meters of floating Bailey Bridge in 8 days. Under fire, in flood conditions, with a river that changed level every few hours. The previous record for a floating Bailey Bridge was 555 meters. This bridge was more than double that length. The causeway work continued through late February. Engineers extended and improved the approaches as the floodplain dried. By March 1st, the bridge could handle continuous traffic. Tanks crossed day and night, trucks, artillery, ammunition convoys, every vehicle supporting Montgomery's advance toward the Rhine. Operation Veritable concluded on March 11th. The Germans had been pushed back across the Rhine, the West Bank was secure. Montgomery began planning the Rhine crossing itself. Operation Plunder. The assault would launch on March 23rd, and it would succeed largely because Montgomery could concentrate his forces, because he could move armor quickly, because bridges like the one at Gennep had kept his offensive moving. The Gennep bridge remained in service until well after the war ended. A permanent bridge was not completed until 1955. For 10 years, the Bailey Bridge carried traffic across the Maas, civilian vehicles, reconstruction equipment, the materials that rebuilt the Netherlands. The bridge that had been built for war became a tool for peace. Hunt was promoted to major. He returned to England after VE Day, went back to the Thames, became a waterman again, taught navigation and rivercraft at City and East London College until 1985. He was appointed Queen's Barge Master in 1978. He died in July 2022 at age 102. Lambrechtsen returned to Rijkswaterstaat after the liberation, spent the next 2 decades rebuilding the Dutch water management system that the war had destroyed. The dikes, the locks, the flood control systems that protected the Netherlands from the sea. A memorial was unveiled at Gennep on May 11, 2022. Hunt attended, age 102. He stood at the site where the bridge had been built 77 years earlier, where 8 men had died building a bridge that helped end the war, where he and a Dutch engineer had solved an impossible problem with mathematics, steel, and determination. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about engineers who saved thousands with floating pontoons and hydraulics calculations. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Hunt and Lambrechtsen don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.